presentation talks about the MAGIC protocol done by Boehringer Ingelheim in 2006 along with Iowa State University to assess the impact of PCV2 virus and other disease conditions in PCVAD in pigs in the U.S. And this was a project we did in 2006. The acronym MAGIC stands for Monitoring Assignment for a Global Insight of Circovirus Disease, and that really represents accurately what we wanted to do in this project. It began in late 2005 as an idea and was operating in 2006 when really circovirus was still just a new problem in the U.S. And a lot of people either didn't understand the disease or in some cases didn't even believe that it was a real disease, that circovirus wasn't the cause. So we wanted to understand the disease, the role PCV2 played in that disease, and the role of other cofactors like PRRS. So our goals were to determine that those agents that were present during the period of high mortality. With PCV2, that virus needs other infections to make it worse, and they have to be happening at the same time. So it was very important that we understood what was going on during the peak mortality. We wanted to understand the role in point number 2 of PCV2 and really understand how PCV2 and other diseases interacted. We solicited farms throughout the U.S. We had 59 farms who completed all of the project and the diagnostic results in 2006. And these animals were from farms throughout the U.S., Southeast, Midwest, Far West, etc. And their total production represented about 30% of the pigs finished in the U.S. So we had some very large systems all the way down to some 500 sow farms. So a nice broad variety. Those farms completed a summary that described some of their health characteristics. And then we did some diagnostic sampling across the farm. Now that included a serum sample where we collected blood from pigs at multiple ages throughout the production flow with an idea to understand what disease agents they'd been exposed to. This was to give us a sense of timing, what was happening when. And that's critically important with PCV2 because, again, these cofactors, to be important with PCVAD, have to be happening at the same time. And you can see we had some pretty large modern confinements all the way down to very typical or traditional production systems. Most importantly, and the thing that was unique, is we went to those farms and actually posted pigs. With PCV2, to confirm the disease, you have to have lesions looked at under a microscope and submitted to a diagnostic lab. So we went in at 3 different time points, and at each of those points took 4 typical sick pigs and 1 healthy pig, and wanted to look at those pigs and how they compared to one another at each of those times to see what the sick pigs had compared to the good ones. We took those time points at the peak clinical disease when the mortality was the highest, around 3 weeks before that peak, and again 6 weeks before the peak. And the goal for that was really to understand the progression of the disease over time and really understand what was going on.
I thought it interesting, you commented that you went to efforts to make sure that there was continuity in the observation of these pigs.
Mm-hmm. Correct. We had the diagnostic staff at the VDL in Ames perform these, and in fact we had one pathologist, Dr. Schwartz, who did almost 90% of these cases. So we had the same set of eyes looking at the same set of tissues, collected under the same circumstances with the same formatting throughout all of these farms to really help take a lot of the biases out of the picture. We took those pigs and we looked at them using some very traditional technology like histopathology, looking under a microscope, to new technology like PCRs for PRRS, influenza, mycoplasma, and even a PCR, a quantitative PCR for PCV2. We looked under the scope to see what the lesions were and to confirm if PCV2 is present and to really understand what else was present as well. So truly a complete diagnostic workup. In summary, we looked for these specific lesions on the slide showing an intestinal lesion with PCV2, which visibly looks a lot like ileitis, but under a microscope is very different. And one of the typical first presenting signs for PCVAD is diarrhea. And that's because there's an inflammation in the small and large intestine where that virus lives. Key cofactors, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail slide by slide, were PRRS virus was detected in about 3/4 of the farms sampled. Secondly, and a surprise, was Salmonella. Influenza was found in about 30% of the farms, and that tended to be very specific by flow, was not very generalized, and mycoplasma was detected at the same time as PCV2 in only 20% of the farms. Mycoplasma was a bit of a surprise in that mycoplasma has been pretty well defined by some researchers at Iowa State, Dr. Thacker and others, as to be a key cofactor. And when mycoplasma is growing in a pig at the same time as PCV2, they increase each other. They're synergistic. The key take-home for us in this study was we did not find mycoplasma very often using some fairly sensitive tests, and that told us that vaccines were doing their job. They were keeping mycoplasma controlled. There were some misunderstandings in Canada when the disease first started to happen there, and some people stopped vaccinating for mycoplasma and really made their problem significantly worse. So our key message here, if you're using a myco vaccine, keep doing it, don't quit. Influenza was the third most common co-infection or cofactor. And again, this was fairly specific to certain farms or areas. It was not a widespread feature. It may have been biased a little bit by season because we collected most of our samples in spring and summer, and there's some seasonality to flu, but in general, we did not find this to be a big cofactor. The biggest surprise was Salmonella, where we saw a lot of enteritis, very classic for Salmonella. We isolated the organism and saw serologic exposure to Salmonella in pigs during this peak clinical disease. And what we've learned since we started this study is that PCV2 virus really loves to replicate in the intestine. And as I said earlier, diarrhea is one of the typical first signs. This thing spreads very easily in contaminated manure. So sanitation in the barns is key, pig flow is key, and it makes perfectly good sense that Salmonella travels that same way as well. We do know as well from PRRS research done by Dr. Zimmerman at Iowa State that when you have Salmonella present at the same time as PRRS, that will boost the amount of PRRS virus present. So really when you get the three of these together, Salmonella, PRRS, and PCV2, they're all really working to increase one another. And it really makes the situation nasty when they're all there at once. We do know from some studies if we control PCV2, we may also help control the level of Salmonella in those pigs as well. And certainly we know that vaccinating pigs, we can reduce the Salmonella load. To control Salmonella, you can look at medications or vaccinations. If you do use vaccines, we really recommend people to vaccinate early. We think we get a better response to the vaccine in very young pigs, and certainly it's easier compliance. You can either do it by drench or by vaccination in the water. And Intercell SC54, which is Boehringer's Salmonella vaccine, does have the unique feature of being able to control the circulation in the pig of multiple isolates of Salmonella, not just cholera suis or typhimurium, but many different kinds that are there. PRRS was the number one cofactor, and that's not a surprise. This was in about 3/4 of farms. We've had some people with some very good response to PRRS vaccination as a way to help control PCVAD, and we'll work through a case of that here in a moment. But timing is really critical if you're going to try to control PRRS as a cofactor. PRRS vaccination in pigs can be successful against any type of PRRS virus isolate, but you really need time. 4 weeks ahead of the exposure is really critical to mount a successful immune response to the vaccine, and that's where our posting multiple ages of pigs and our sequential serology really helps us out. We really can identify it right when PRRS virus is circulating so that the producer can time the use of the vaccines appropriately to get a great response. And we know from our MAGIC projects that producers that were already using PRRS virus vaccines had pigs that had less severe PCV2 virus lesions in them. So we have some great evidence that PRRS vaccine will help control PRRS itself, but also will help effects of PCV2 in pigs too. PRRS, the big challenge we see today is that PRRS is kind of getting hidden inside the whole circovirus associated disease complex. Makes sense to worry about PCV2 and its role in there, but don't forget about PRRS. That's a key player that's been there and isn't going to go away even if you vaccinate for PCV2. You're still going to have the risk of those lesions. We know when PRRS and PCV2 are together, based on some lab studies at Iowa State, as well as our field research, that really those two make mortality much, much worse. So we need to control both of those key factors in PCVAD. This next slide really details the success of a commercial production system in using this combined approach to control PCVAD. In period 1, the percent of pigs marketed was only about 70% of those pigs placed into the finishing barn. So they had 30% mortality, culls, and lights. So really PCVAD was impacting this farm pretty dramatically. Phase 2, they utilized vaccination against both PRRS and Salmonella, because those were 2 of their 3 key cofactors along with PCV2. They saw their percent marketed pigs rise to over 80%, so a very nice response of more than 10% of pigs marketed. When PRRS virus control slipped in period 3, they discontinued vaccinating pigs for a period of time while they depopulated the nursery, and then started vaccinating again in period 4, but you'll see the response again was pretty similar, about 80% of the pigs marketed. So that impact was repeatable on 2 different applications. Next period, you'll see over 90% marketings. That's when they had the combined use of all 3 products, a vaccine against PCV2, PRRS, and Salmonella, where they had almost 95% of the pigs that were placed in the barn were marketed successfully in the right weight window. And in the last period, you can see the drop-off again once PCV2 vaccines were no longer available for this producer. They have since re-implemented PCV2 vaccine, this time with Engelvac Circoflex, back to that same type of performance, about 95% of pigs marketed successfully. So a nice replication of that disease control. As a quick review, when you see PCVAD itself without these big co-infections, you still see increased mortality. In barns where PCV2 is the only major cofactor, we may see 8 to 10% mortality. When we add Salmonella and PRRS to it, that's when our mortality really jumps, and we'll see double or more mortality in those cases. And that's why we think it's still important to control Salmonella, control PRRS. There's an opportunity by controlling those diseases to get added benefit. Make a complete diagnostic workup when you're looking at PCVAD on your farm. Remember, the disease affects multiple systems, the respiratory system with pneumonia, diarrhea in the gut, wasting away. Have a good diagnosis with your veterinarian and understand that PCV2 really likes inflammation, and that's where these cofactors like PRRS, like Mycoplasma, like Salmonella really come into play and stimulate the amount of PCV2 virus present. Work with your veterinarian to get a diagnosis, both in individual pigs and in your herd, and design an application of vaccination and medication controls that fits your farm's own cofactor profile. Every farm's going to be a little different. What agents are there, what timing they circulate. So it really is important to place those vaccines and treatments at the right time to have the maximum benefit for your farm.
How do you envision the future of MAGIC? Is it a long-term program, or was this 1 year out?
MAGIC in 2006 was really designed, as we said, to help us truly understand the disease and what was going on. MAGIC in 2007 will happen again. It'll be on a somewhat more limited basis with a different set of customers, really tailored now to understanding how to place treatments effectively. We feel we've got a good handle on cofactors and the role they play. Now we need to help producers place treatments successfully.
Yeah. What do you want them to carry?
I think the key takeaways for PCV2 really is, number one, confirm that is the disease. When you've got 20 or 30% mortality, that's pretty clear. But if it's not that high, there are other things that cause problems too. And right now, PCVAD is the sexy disease. Everybody thinks they have it. It's an expensive vaccine. The other treatments are expensive, so let's get a good confirmation, A, that you have it, and B, understand the cofactors that are there. Once you do that, you can put a good control program in place and see the results like this producer had, where they've gone from 70% to 90% or more marketed successfully.